There is a doorway that appears without announcement. No one tells you it's coming. No guidebook marks its location. No teacher in a classroom. No voice in a sermon. No advice passed down over a kitchen table ever points to the moment and says, "This is where everything quietly tilts." Somewhere around the age of 60, you find yourself standing before it. And what waits on the other side is not what you were prepared for. It isn't decline. It isn't the long, slow diminishing that the world has trained you to expect. It isn't even loss, though loss may have been the thing that brought you close enough to finally notice the doorway at all. It is a return to something so deeply yours, so quietly essential, that for decades you simply forgot it was there. Carl Jung called this the great turning of the second half of life. Not a fall, but an opening. Not a retreat, but a homecoming to the self that was always waiting. From the outside, 60 can look unremarkable. The pace slows. The noise of earlier decades begins to recede. People around you may assume you are settling, winding down, drawing back from the world's stage. They may look at your quieter schedule and see diminishment. But inside, something is waking. There is a reorganization happening beneath the surface of your days. One that no mirror can show you, no blood test can detect, no casual conversation can hold without collapsing under the weight of its implications. The soul is changing direction, not violently, not with the force of a breaking wave. It changes direction the way a deep river changes course, slowly, patiently, response to pressures so gradual that by the time you notice the new direction, it has already been true for a long time. Begin to sense it in small things first. A conversation that once felt significant leaves you feeling strangely hollow. Goal you spent years constructing no longer stirs anything real inside you. A room full of familiar people now leaves you longing for something you cannot name. Compliment that would once have satisfied you now skims across the surface of your life and sinks without a trace. This is not restlessness. It is not ordinary dissatisfaction. It is the soul beginning to demand what it has always been owed. Carl Jung observed something that most of the modern world still struggles to accept. Believed that a human life is not a single arc moving toward its peak and then sliding toward irrelevance. Saw life as two genuinely distinct phases, each with its own purpose, its own logic, its own particular demands on the self. The first half, he said, is about formation, building the ego, establishing an identity in the external world, through education, through ambition, through the careful construction of a self that the world can understand, engage with, and reward. It is, in many ways, a performance, necessary and valuable one, but a performance nonetheless. The second half is something altogether different. In the second half, Jung believed the psyche begins moving toward what he called individuation, the process of becoming genuinely, fully, authentically whole, return to the deeper version of the self that was gradually covered over by years of social expectation, familial obligation, and the relentless pressure to be a particular kind of useful. At 60, this process accelerates. The soul no longer tolerates the performance, no longer accepts the mask. It does not want the version of you that was built for the approval of the audience. It wants the version of you that exists beneath all of that, unfiltered, unperformed, essential. And for many, encounter with the unmasked self is the most transformative experience of an entire lifetime. There is a particular exhaustion that arrives in this phase, and it is unlike any tiredness you have felt before. It is not the exhaustion of physical effort. It is not even the deep weariness that follows grief or sustained hardship, though many have carried both of those for a very long time. This exhaustion is existential, is the fatigue of having been someone else's version of you for too long, the fatigue of making yourself smaller in order to fit spaces that were never designed for who you truly are, the fatigue of performing emotions you did not feel and suppressing the ones you did, of smiling in moments when something inside you was quietly unraveling, of chasing validation from people who were too absorbed in their own survival to truly see you, of postponing your own truth indefinitely and calling that devotion. At 60, the soul simply refuses this anymore, begins to withdraw its energy from what is hollow and redirect it toward what is real. You may find yourself with less patience for conversations that orbit around nothing of substance, less willing to maintain relationships that require you to disappear into a smaller version of yourself, less interested in spending your limited hours proving your worth to those who have already made their judgments. This is not bitterness. This is not becoming hard or closed or cold. It is clarity. It is the soul filtering, choosing what deserves the finite energy of this particular season of life. And that choosing, that deliberate and courageous turning away from what diminishes you, one of the most profound acts of self-respect a person can perform. There is another dimension to this shift, one that Jung described with particular depth and care. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not the enemy within. It is not darkness in the moral sense. It's the villain of your interior life. The shadow is everything in you that you were never permitted to be. Tenderness you learned to conceal because the world called it weakness. The ambition you buried because someone made you feel it was unseemly. Anger you pressed down for decades because it was deemed too disruptive, too much, too real. Grief you swallowed in silence because the world did not offer enough space or time for it. Dreams you quietly archived in the back rooms of yourself because life demanded something more immediately practical. All of it lives in the shadow, and in the second half of life it begins to move, not to punish you, to overwhelm you or drag you backward into what was painful, but to be integrated, to be seen, be finally brought into the light of conscious awareness. Because without that integration, wholeness remains a concept rather than a lived reality. At 60, it is not uncommon to find yourself suddenly drawn to things you abandoned decades ago. A creative impulse you once suffocated because there wasn't time, wasn't money, wasn't permission, part of your personality that was considered inconvenient and quietly set aside. A voice within you that has been trying to speak since childhood, but was never handed the microphone. That is the shadow asking for its rightful place in your story, and the invitation is not to fear it, but to listen, to ask real curiosity and without judgment what this part of you actually needs. Something else begins to happen in this period. Something that touches the very structure of what you value. Hierarchy of what matters starts to reorganize itself. Things that once felt urgent, status, output, steady accumulation of titles and credentials and tokens of social worth, begin to loosen their hold on you, and in their place, something far quieter rises to the surface. Presence, depth, genuine connection, truth told without performance. Begin to measure your days differently. not by what was produced or accomplished or displayed, by what was actually inhabited, what was truly felt, what was genuinely said, what was honestly lived. Achievement that once commanded all your attention now feels like a distraction from something far more essential. Approval you once needed from external sources now matters less than the quiet approval you extend to yourself. Stay with this, because what comes next is the part that matters most. This reversal is not a symptom of withdrawal. It is not apathy. It is not what the uninformed sometimes dismiss as losing your edge or giving up. It is the psyche reorganizing its priorities in deep alignment with the soul's actual purpose. Jung understood that the ego's goals and the soul's goals are not always moving in the same direction. The ego craves recognition. The soul craves meaning. The ego wants to win. The soul wants to understand. The ego needs an audience. The soul needs silence, spaciousness, the long, uninterrupted time to think. At 60, the soul begins to win this negotiation, and what looks like a retreat from the outside is reality, the most significant advance of a lifetime. Something subtle but seismic happens to the very language of your interior life at this age. Words that once carried one meaning begin to carry another entirely. Take the word time. Earlier in life, time was a resource to maximize, deadline to race against, a gap between where you were and where you needed to be. But at 60, time begins to feel like a texture rather than a container. You move through it differently. You inhabit it rather than consume it. Find yourself less interested in filling it efficiently and more interested in experiencing it honestly. Or take the word love. For much of a lifetime, love was bound up with need, with longing, with the hope of being completed by another person, the unspoken transaction of giving in order to receive in return. But at 60, love tends to become something more spacious, less about what it offers you, and more about what you can genuinely contribute. Less performance and demonstration, and more quiet presence, listening without agenda, a staying without condition. Or take the word enough. For most of a lifetime, enough was a destination that kept receding. There was always more to acquire, more to achieve, more to become. But somewhere in the territory of 60, enough begins to feel like a gift rather than a resignation. The life you have built, with all its complexity and compromise, turns out to be sufficient. The person you have become, scarred and wise and still in process, turns out to be worthy. Or take the word silence. Once, silence was something to escape. It held the uncomfortable questions, the unfinished business, the echoes of things not said. But at 60, silence changes character entirely. It becomes a resource, a place of return, a texture you seek out rather than flee from, because you have finally learned how much it holds, and how much of your own self is available only in its presence. These are not small shifts in preference. They represent a fundamental transformation in the relationship between your inner life and the world you move through. The soul is no longer trying to impress the world. It is trying to understand itself. This phase requires something from you in return. It asks that certain things be allowed to fall away. Not people, not your love, your care, or your capacity for connection. Versions of yourself that have served their purpose and can no longer carry you forward into the life that remains. The version of you that required approval from everyone in every room. The version that confused relentless busyness with genuine worth. The version that indefinitely postponed its own needs and called that selflessness. the version that adjusted its personality depending on who was watching and what they seemed to require. These versions were never failures. They were survival strategies, built in response to real circumstances, real pressures, real fears at particular moments in your history. Do not need to condemn them, but you do need to release them. Because if you carry them forward into this new season of life, come like garments you have outgrown, heavy, constricting, constantly reminding you that you are dressed for a life you are no longer actually living. The letting go is not easy. Anyone who presents it as a simple matter has not yet truly done it. There is grief inside it. Is a period of disorientation when the old self has already dissolved, and the new one has not yet fully taken shape. Jung's understood this as a kind of symbolic death, and, like all genuine deaths, it is the necessary condition for what comes after. What rises from that letting go is something quieter than what you were before, less preoccupied with being witnessed, less driven by external measurement, less interested in the performance of a life well lived, and more committed to the experience of it. But it is also finally entirely yours. There is a kind of blossoming that occurs in the second half of life that has no equivalent in youth. It is not the spring of your 20s, urgent, reckless, full of the particular brilliance that comes from not yet knowing what can be lost. This spring is different in every way that matters. It is slower, more intentional, grows from soil that has been broken and turned and composted by decades of genuine experience. It does not promise ease, but it offers something youth never could: the deep, settled knowledge of who you actually are. Certainty that comes only from having been tested repeatedly and having each time found your way through. This is why so many people, and particularly many women, describe their 60s not as a closing down, but as a profound and unexpected opening, shedding of the long-worn obligation to be palatable, manageable, appropriately contained. Discovery of a voice that was always present, but too careful, too accommodating, too practiced in the art of not disrupting the room to use its full register. At 60, that changes. The voice becomes fuller, boundaries become clearer and require less justification. The choices become more genuinely aligned with the interior life rather than the exterior audience. And there is a beauty to this, a particular, unmistakable quality of presence that cannot be manufactured, cannot be purchased, cannot be approximated by any amount of youth or surface performance. It is the beauty of someone who has finally stopped hiding. Those who encounter it feel something they often cannot immediately name: a groundedness, a fullness, quality of being that makes the usual performances of the social world seem suddenly thin by comparison. Jung gave a precise name to this process, called it individuation, the lifelong journey toward becoming fully, authentically oneself. He was particularly attentive to what happened in its later stages, in what he called the second half of life. He noticed that those who were willing to engage honestly with this process, to face the shadow, to integrate the unlived portions of themselves, to gradually release the ego's grip on identity, underwent a transformation he considered the most complete and meaningful available to a human being. Not the dramatic self-discovery of a young person encountering their own depths for the first time. That is its own sacred passage. Quieter, deeper transformation of someone who has spent decades building a life, and who now more self-awareness and courage than youth possesses, allows that life to be rebuilt from the inside outward. This is not therapy, though therapy can be a companion to it. It is not religion, though spiritual frameworks can hold the space for it. It is something more intimate than either. It is the private, ongoing negotiation between the self you have performed for the world across decades, the self that has always lived quietly inside you, patient, persistent, and entirely impossible to fully extinguish. At 60, this negotiation becomes not just possible, but urgent. Not because time is running out, that is the ego's particular fear, not the soul's concern, because the soul has been waiting long enough. It is ready to take its place at the center, ready to stop playing the supporting role in your own life and become what it always was, the lead. If you could hear the soul speaking plainly, not in symbols or metaphors or the language of dreams, but in the simplest possible terms, what it would say is not complicated. I want to stop performing. I want to be in rooms where I do not have to carefully manage how I appear. Conversations where I do not have to file the edges off myself to become acceptable. Relationships where I am genuinely known. Not the curated version, not the pleasant and productive flasis I maintained for the world. The actual, complicated, tender, difficult, irreducibly human self that I am. I want to do things because they matter to me, because they prove something to someone else. I want to rest without the persistent undertow of guilt, to create without requiring an audience, to love without maintaining a hidden accounting of whether it is being returned in equal measure. I simply want to be fully here. This is what the soul wants at 60. Not triumph, not legacy built other people's admiration, not the final accounting of your achievements arranged for the world to evaluate. Just presence, just truth, just the profound, ordinary freedom of being completely yourself in the time that remains. And the thing that takes most people by surprise, the thing that takes their breath away when it is first understood, is that this desire, this long suppressed desire, simply to be rather than to perform, turns out to be the most generative, most creative, most genuinely productive force a person can access. Because when you are no longer spending your interior energy managing appearances, maintaining performances, and anticipating judgments, energy becomes available for everything else. For depth, for real connection, for creativity that does not need applause to sustain itself, for a quality of wisdom that does not need to announce itself to be true. There is a quality of light that comes through a window in the late afternoon. It is not the brilliant overhead clarity of noon, does not possess the same intensity, but there is something in it, a warmth, a particular texture, way it falls across familiar things and makes them visible in a new way that noon light never achieves. The second half of life is that light, is not the blazing certainty of youth. It does not carry the same forward momentum or appetite for conquest. What it offers in exchange is something richer and more sustaining. The capacity to be present to your own experience without constantly trying to optimize it. The freedom to sit with complexity without demanding its resolution. The ability to feel grief and gratitude simultaneously, to hold contradiction without being undone by it, to be broken and whole at exactly the same moment. These are not consolation prizes for what has been lost. They are distinct gifts, available only at this particular stage, precisely because of everything that has been lived and survived and slowly understood. they become accessible, because the ego has loosened its grip, because you have been broken open enough times to stop pretending you are sealed, because the shadow has been acknowledged and some of its contents, quietly, painfully, necessarily, have been brought into the light. Jung's deepest vision of the second half of life was fundamentally about integration. Not just the integration of the shadow, though that is essential, but the gathering together of all the separated parts, the aspects of yourself that were expressed and the ones that were pressed, the roles you played, and the self that watched quietly from behind them, the wounds you carried and the wisdom they eventually produced, person you showed the world and the person you were entirely alone. When these parts begin to come together, not perfectly, not without friction, honestly, and without judgment, something shifts in the quality of a person's presence that cannot be faked or hurried. They become, in the most precise sense, more themselves. Not more of the constructed ego, but more of the consciousness beneath it. More of the being that has been quietly observing the whole performance, patient and enduring and impossible to fully silence. That quality of integration, that fullness, is something the people around you will sense without being able to name it. Your children sense it, closest friends sense it. Sometimes even strangers, sitting across from you for only a few minutes, feel something they cannot articulate. A groundedness, a wholeness, a quality of attention that registers as rare. That is what it looks like when a soul has stopped fighting itself. If you have stayed with this conversation all the way to the end, something in you recognized what has been described here. Perhaps you are already standing at that doorway. Perhaps you are somewhere in the middle of the passage, disoriented, uncertain, not quite the person you were, and not yet fully the person you are in the process of becoming. Or perhaps you have already come through it and are still finding words for what happened. Wherever you are in this, know this. What you are experiencing is not a problem that needs to be solved. It is not a crisis to be managed or a symptom to be treated. It is an invitation, the most significant invitation your own soul will ever extend to you. The invitation to stop being who you were told to be, to finally discover, with real curiosity and without apology, who you actually are. Take all the scattered pieces of your story, the sacrifices made without recognition, the losses absorbed without ceremony, unlived dreams set carefully aside, the love you gave without return, pain you survived without anyone around you fully understanding what it cost, and to gather them into something whole, not perfect, not resolved, true. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. At 60, that privilege is not diminishing, just arriving. Write something in the comments, a sentence, a word, an intention that belongs to this new chapter of your life, not for anyone else's benefit, for yours. Because the act of naming what you are stepping into makes it real in a way that silence cannot. Something in this found you. If it touched a part of yourself you had almost forgotten was still there. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are people in your life standing at the same doorway, alone without a map, wondering if what they are feeling is something to be afraid of. Tell them it isn't. If this resonated with you, join our community at Silent Resonance. This is a space where the soul is given room to breathe. The second half of life is treated not as a footnote, but as the most important chapter of all, where every truth that is hard to say is given a voice. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a conversation worth having with Yourself.